In the early 2000s, the fantasy epic was just beginning to be popular in the public eye. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies had graced us with 3 of the best films ever made, and its culminating conclusion was drowning in Oscars. It would then open the floodgates for many film series to be greenlit, with possibilities of sequels, and see if even a spark of Jackson's lightning in a bottle could be captured. With all the positive reception and money coming from the films and merchandise, big companies also wanted in on this action. A franchise based on a book would mean that there would be an already invested audience for the adaptation, and that there would be an outlining of plans for future installments already set out. Disney wanted a piece of this pie, and so they signed a deal with the family of the late C.S. Lewis for the Chronicles of Narnia. These big screen adaptations were a hit with audiences, especially in regards to the first film, and they expanded into the zeitgeist of Lewis's world. James McAvoy's Thomas is top tier even while sharing with Tilda Swinton's incredible White Witch performance. Every motion he makes in meeting Lucy is an uncomfortable internal struggle with what he's charged to do, being torn by a child's kindness and naive admiration of what Narnia is now, to what these innocent and oblivious words make him remember what Narnia was. With very few exceptions, the CG and art style has barely aged a day, and every creature design in the adaptation is incredibly well done, giving the best visual look Narnia has ever had. I'm also a big fan of how in the finale, the witch uses the shaved mane of Aslan in her costume, where in the book, the shaving was just for humiliation. She's trying to invoke the same lioness authority, and this confidence of the battle being won is only something that can be shattered by the true lion's arrival. As the series went on, however, it started to show that the stories were not made to be grandiose and epic as something like The Lord of the Rings, but instead smaller, approachable, and episodic stories, more like The Hobbit. Much like what we would see in The Hobbit in 2012, the thematic changes would be executed well in some places, and less so in others. The first 2 films of the franchise were box office successes, but nevertheless saw Disney drop the franchise to Fox for a 3rd film. A less acclaimed movie would be the unceremonious end, without covering the rest of the books. With this venture into the franchise, however, came toys, fast food promotions, and of course video games. For its Disney movie run, all the stops were pulled in 2005 for people to experience Narnia on the platforms of their choice. My goal here is to play through these titles, starting with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and see how they hold up today, how they represented the time they were made in, and how a video game can adapt the world of Narnia. I have no way of approaching this in an unbiased state. I've loved the Chronicles of Narnia for as long as I can remember, and the Disney adapted films came out at an impressionable part of my childhood. For this video, I reread the books, I rewatched the movies, yup, those ones too. I even played some of these games in a beautiful secluded winter cottage, and when I returned home, was greeted by the thematic thawing greens of the oncoming spring. Is some of this an excuse to relive childhood nostalgia? Perhaps on a subconscious level, but the main reason is to look into these video games and see how the adaptation relates to both the movie and the books. Do they stick plainly to the atmosphere that the film provides, or are they influenced by the original material or other gaming trends of the time? There are expected niceties, tragedies, and incredibly welcome surprises. So let's jump into the wardrobe and have a look. The variation of each version have Buena Vista Games proudly labeled on the front cover. However, it's on the back that we see 2 different developers who were primarily responsible for the console and handheld editions respectively. The console and PC version was created by Traveller's Tales, known now for their incredibly successful LEGO games, but before had also seen success with games like Mickey Mania, Sonic R, and Toy Story 2. The Chronicles of Narnia would release less than a year after the launch of the original LEGO Star Wars, and in some ways you can see the characteristics of it, but also other very different but easily understandable influences. To start the game off, the first level takes place in an introduction created by the filmmakers to portray the children during the Blitz of London. It's a scene that only takes up 2 minutes of the screen time, but its inclusion really does help shape the impression of who the protagonists of the story are. The original book was published in 1950, only 5 years after the Second World War, so its explanation of the air raids felt like something that didn't need to be dwelt on. To a far lesser extent, you need only say the words 2020 pandemic to invoke recent memories. So too was Lewis trying to say this at the time with limited vocabulary at the beginning of his book. The movie then wisely chooses to include the air raid scene not only to frame the situation and hardships for the children, but also give a glimpse as to who they are and how the children are shown in extreme circumstances. The air raids are the tutorial for the game, but as it teaches you the controls and abilities of the characters, it's also fighting to keep suspension of disbelief. In this scene of escaping a house that could potentially be bombed by Nazis, it also takes a time to stop and incentivize collecting tokens that are littered throughout the building. Even when the house is ablaze, the moments of tension so carefully crafted in the film cannot be maintained, as you punch the furniture for coins. Where games like LEGO can get away with this much easier, it's because of the plastic source material and lighthearted nature. The areas are made of LEGO, so why not take them apart like you would in real life? This isn't to say that the game can't have fun romps and adventuring, it's just about knowing how to read the room, and in this case, it's on fire. Things thankfully improve almost instantly as the levels progress. Edmund and Lucy's first trip to Narnia are merged together to have co-op play, which serves neither Narnian interactions justice, but the levels are much more friendly and lower stakes, giving a lovely snowy environment to solve puzzles in. The following level in the Professor's house feels maze-like as described in the books, and it uses the film's expanded emphasis on MacReady as a stealth element to keep adding some stakes to not be caught. The game finally comes into full swing when we have a lengthier level in which the ensemble of the 4 children is put to good effect in traversing Lantern Wastes as they fight and explore the environment. There's a point in this level where the children fall on ice chunks and slide down a hill while being chased by an avalanche. During my recording, I fell into the chasms multiple times and couldn't focus because of how much I was laughing at the absurdity of it all. While the air raids are based on real-life events and trying to portray time-sensitive stakes in a very serious manner, this part was just trying to be a very video-gamey game. I couldn't judge this because minutes earlier, I had crashed down a rock face using nothing but a weaponized 10-year-old and proceeded to beat up a small army of wolves. It's over the top, but in a land of centaurs and fawns, it feels appropriate. TT Games' Narnia also tries to find a balance of keeping the action and the adventure. As in all the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe games, we will find that the combat is the main workhorse of gameplay, where the books don't dwell on it much at all. This is of course the expectation of what the movie would adapt, to make the action more heavy in the script. If we were following the book, or even the film, Peter wouldn't have had his first battle until more than halfway through the story. Adventure games without combat are a difficult challenge to create, especially when the latter half of your story features a lot of it. You can't just create a new system of gameplay that the players will have to learn in the first part and swap to something entirely different for the second. For the first and second act, however, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe tries to have a healthy serving of non-violent fun with puzzle solving of the world, before going back to the meat and potatoes of monster fighting. When it comes to the combat, here we can see the very clear correlation with what the game is trying to replicate, and that is the 2002 and 2003 Lord of the Rings hack-and-slash games. It's not a bad inspiration, as not only were the films a large component of why Narnia was greenlit, but the games were received well, and do a very good job of giving the atmosphere that the action scenes in the film portray. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are competitive orc killing machines, and so the game reflects that with its combo and kill rankings. Narnia borrows quite a lot from these games, and while it wears these similarities on its sleeve, they are mostly incorporated in a lot of ways that work. It's also important, however, to see what was sacrificed to make this thematic transition. Looking at the box art, while the handheld games have E and E10 ratings on the ESRB, this game received a T rating, and on the back proudly shows the enemies you'll be fighting. It's a far cry from the film, to say nothing of the books that were originally intended for younger audiences. This could have been a tactic to have an engaging Narnia title for a varied age demographic, but it's an interesting snowball effect to say the least, that the game needs to base itself on the film and therefore become more about action when so much of the original adventure was about journeying and social interactions. When it does come to more mature moments such as Aslan killing the witch, it cuts the scene up supposedly to keep it more family friendly, despite it again being a T-rated game. Speaking of thematic transitions and scenes, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe also features the same technique of film to cutscene that was done in The Lord of the Rings. The result is a bit distracting, however. I think where The Lord of the Rings did this well was its varied ways of transitioning film to game, and to its benefit, Return of the King and The Two Towers are darker in palette. Being snowy and then verdant green, it lends to brighter lighting, showing its uncanny valley nature. Fortunately, most cinematics before and after levels are done using cut-up clips from the film, which was a benefit of the era to finally have the storage and space to contain decent quality videos. Sadly, however, neither in gameplay nor in shots from the film is there any sign of the incredible music done by Harry Gregson Williams. Instead, the game is scored by what feels like temp music. I suppose it's because the game has less of a score to run with for action scenes like something in The Lord of the Rings, but it's a shame that for occasions like Lucy and Tummas mating, there isn't this warm friendliness like there is in Tummas's theme.
Were you hiding from me?
No. Well, no, I was just, I didn't want to scare you. You must be some kind of beardless dwarf?
Were you hiding from me?
No. Well, no, I was just, I didn't want to scare you.
If you don't mind my asking, what are you?
Well, I'm a fawn. And what about you? You must be some kind of beardless dwarf?
The game also wraps up kind of quickly. For example, the witch stabbing Edmund, but never showing him recovering. He's there for the coronation, but the scene of him almost dying is a concluding character moment for the siblings, and it's very emblematic that the game keeps the action while leaving out the intention. Also, the children never return home. Despite these grievances, I still enjoyed the time I had with this game. It certainly has some bits of jank, and there are perhaps too many cinematics that interrupt gameplay, but it does still scratch the itch of a decent movie tie-in from the 6th console generation. The levels are fun, and there are some fresh ideas to the formula, with using the children as a pair for different strengths. I'm also a sucker for the bonus features and behind the scenes that the game provides. This inclusion is not so prevalent anymore in the era of YouTube and much larger portion of the gaming community having a good idea of how games are made. For this reason, it's a fun relic from a time that harkens back to DVDs and special features that this generation of consoles were also starting to involve. Narnia on consoles is familiar, and the closest to replicating scenes in the film that we'll see in this entry, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you like cinematic hack-and-slash adventures in an English isekai, this game is a fun couple of hours. Moving over to handhelds, we can see that these titles were made by a different developer. Amaze Entertainment, with its sub-brand Kryptonite Games, was a company in the late 90s and 2000s who specialized in making mobile adaptations and movie tie-ins. Much like mobile game adaptations on phones today, this was a sustainable niche that needed to be filled by a company. With these licensed property games came timelines, and with these being less prioritized handheld games, came smaller budgets. In many ways, these games were as much promotional marketing as they were methods of having an unaffiliated product being released at the same time. They were not expected to be remarkable, nor given the resources to make it that way. Looking at the Game Boy Advance version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it has a lot of limitations to telling the story of how the Pevensies came to Narnia. The solution for this game is to water down this part of the story. In its defense, the original book wastes barely any time before Lucy finds herself in the wardrobe, and rather than have the children stand and talk for a long stretch of time, or portray a long scene describing why the children are at the house, it's more enticing to get straight to the wardrobe and let the player move. It's important to consider that outside the general gaming public, playing handheld games was not very common for older audiences, and for this reason a bulk of the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance games were aimed at the console's titular demographic. Text boxes are also rather small, so to give a larger amount of text would either mean to have a longer section of flipping through dialogue boxes, or to have a larger portion of the screen real estate be covered with text. The latter also becomes more inconvenient when you remember that the standard Game Boy Advance lacked a backlit screen, making reading a more troublesome thing to do. It's excusable, but sadly regrettable. Going through the beginning points, the essentials are still there. Lucy meets Thomas, Edmund meets the witch, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy even have a moment about not believing Lucy and having Edmund be unlikable. Throughout these chaptered levels, however, the game reveals an unfortunately shallow nature. The problem is that there's no reason to engage in combat for most circumstances. Enemies are hurdles in your way, fighting them rewards you with nothing, and by breaking other items and levels, you receive food to alleviate your health bar and nothing else. Some secondary elements need to be considered to make this type of gameplay more engaging, be that managing a secondary reward through collections or upgrading your character abilities. The Game Boy Advance version has both, but it does through only shaky definition alone. Within all the levels are Mr. Thomas's items scattered to be collected, but it's not until after collecting all of them throughout the entire game do you unlock a hard mode for collecting them all. The children will learn skills known as nobilities that are sadly not very remarkable either. On a nice note, there are talking Narnian animals who will bestow these nobilities to you, and fulfilling these requests are fun little side missions that expand on Narnia, its inhabitants, and the children. It's very simple but in an adorable way, such as finding a squirrel's heirloomed acorn. Using these nobilities is not so nice. They are either essential or barely mandatory. One nobility will give you the strength to move a heavy object, and another will have animals come help you to move a heavy object. Use Regal Presence to keep enemies away from you, or use the Stealth nobility to also keep enemies away from you. Even the AI isn't the brightest either, sadly, and so certain levels can be finished by barely fighting any enemies, without even needing to use these talents. Sprinkled throughout these chapters are some interesting aspects that the developers made to give the game a more Narnian feeling. Surprising nobody, winter is cold, and the witch's spell of Endless Frost takes its toll on the characters if they can't reach a fire to warm themselves at. It's a joyous celebration then that when winter ends and the spell is broken, the gameplay complements the thematics to no longer have this issue. There is also a strangely wide selection of food and drinks to rejuvenate the children that becomes less strange when you consider the book. Being a story written for wartime and post-war children, Lewis took his time describing food, and in the same way that Narnia's world was an escape from a battered Britain, the fantasy of unrationed and bountiful food was also just as dreamed of. Sadly, these neat elements don't pull the game out of its multitude of continued flaws. There are plenty of characters, but they can be stun-locked and dispatched with no challenge. Ludonarrative dissonance is every game writer's favorite smart-sounding word, but it shows up in a place too prominent to be ignored. In Peter's battle with Malgrim, he taunts Peter with the statement that he doesn't have what it takes to kill. It makes sense in the book, but for 2 hours I had been destroying enemies with a stick, and then a sword, that, if I may add, does the exact same damage as the stick. I understand that this is a line taken from the movie, but it doesn't make sense in this context, and the console version simply omitted it. The intense battle started and ended with me not moving and tapping the A button a couple of times until the captain of the Queen's secret police was dead. This brevity of narrative punch follows the most significant part of the story. In under a minute, Aslan goes to sacrifice himself, dies, and comes back to life. Whether or not you believe in Christianity and Lewis's messianic portrayal of Aslan, from a narrative perspective, it leaves no impact or emotion because Aslan's suffering and sacrifice is barely portrayed, and the tension of hopelessness is never given time to breathe. The solution to this in the PS2 game and the film was to separate the death and resurrection between when Queen Jadis attacks the Narnians. The remainder of the game is fine, perhaps from its exclusion of needing to focus on nobilities, or that the narrative feels fitting to fight, given that the combat has a purpose, even if it's extrinsic. The level freeing prisoners from the witch's castle is also neat in that they'll assist you with fighting enemies within the level. And hey, this version has Rumblebuffin, the giant who is given more description in the book than the Battle of Baruna.
What's your name?
I am Giant Rumblebuffin, if it please your honor.
Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin, let us out.
Certainly, your honor.
I feel bad being so critical about this game. I highly doubt the developers thought that 18 years later, some donkus would come and make a video essay about a project that probably needed more time in the oven. I think I'm so critical, however, because I know what Amaze Entertainment can do, and that can be found just a handheld away with a game that was released on the very same day. This opening title screen gave me chills. Although there were still likable elements in the GBA version, it feels here like Amaze Entertainment needed to hit a requirement of having two versions, because in almost every aspect, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for the Nintendo DS is not only the better game of the two handhelds, but might also be the most unique Narnia game of the bunch. The game starts with still cutscenes, and they set the atmosphere very well. Using the dual screen of the DS in a creative method, overhead are the air raids over a gloomy London. After a cold steel train takes the children to an unfamiliar house, the restless group of siblings go to play a game of hide-and-seek to find some form of escapism. Much like the Game Boy version, you're right away to the adventure. But first, have the stills to set the scene as to why the children are here, and how Narnia is an escape, even in its never-Christmas winter. Exclusion of content is not something that's inherently bad. In a switch to medium, the developers can choose what does and what does not work to invoke the intended feeling. Sure, the DS game doesn't have the air raid level, but seeing how the console version handled it, perhaps this was a better call. No sooner do you enter the wood that you discover more than just a fawn, but a fawn with dialogue options. While no dialogue choice in the game will change the output, there are still tailored responses to each comment and audio signals that reward you for understanding the response that was most appropriate. One of the interesting conundrums of adaptation is when there are many points of reference to familiarity. Lucy's introduction to Tummis all stems from the book, but to some audiences, they might be more nostalgic and familiar with the 2005 adaptation, BBC adaptation, or the cartoon adaptation. Video games provide a novel way of solving that problem. Here are the options to what this exchange can play out as, and as a participant, you may decide what seems most apt. As the tutorial continues and Tummis leads Lucy to his house, he teaches her how to defend herself by destroying an ice statue of the White Witch. It's a clear indication that his allegiance to her is not out of respect, but over reluctant subjugation. As you venture deeper into the wood, Tummis explains that currency of the game is found in clean ice shards, since clean water is hard to come by. After 100 years of stilled water, I suppose I can buy into this. But more importantly, there is some intention to expand world building. Even if the lines are short, it still conveys a lot of the dire situation that Narnians find themselves in under the rule of the White Witch. Even as a creative workaround to having expository text, Tummis lulls Lucy to sleep by expressing tales of the past that not only retell stories of what Narnia was like from the book, but also give the player control and have a taste of a mini-adventure before the witch had her rule over Narnia. The developers really did go the extra mile to take advantage of Narnia's unique world here, and while the console and PC version feels like a combination of two well-tread game styles and mold the story around them, Narnia on the DS appears to do the opposite and tries its hand to see how it can incorporate the content around the film and book material. The result of this gives the player a more free-form method of exploring Narnia, conversing with the animals, combating the witch's threats, and freeing the good held captive through the icy grip of the Sorceress Queen. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for the DS is an RPG with an overworld and dungeons to explore. By not subjecting the player to levels, it grants the player a freedom to explore, grow, and delve into the story, much more like an explorer than a guest taken down a linear path. With this, it expands leaps and bounds on the combat done in the GBA version. The children not only develop skills and abilities unique to each, but also have a large selection of ways that they can improve. A very small criticism of the film is that Aslan dubs the Pevensies by their Narnian legend names at their coronation, while in the books they develop these titles through their actions as they rule. In a clever method of understanding the source material, the upgradable attributes are gentleness, valiance, justness, and magnificence. It's a fun nod that shows that as the children develop and gain more experience in Narnia, they become more suited for these titles. Equipment can be purchased to make the children stronger, and with that comes the incentive to save and complete quests to accumulate more currency. Winter debuffs also come into effect in this game, but it's also improved to complement the economy of the game. Instead of simply losing health slowly, the children will acquire less XP. To remedy this, instead of setting up a fire, you need to find a warm area, normally a cave or safe space, many of which are not far from a merchant. By coming back to these areas then, it's a great excuse to spend your rewards on items that can make your team stronger. Becoming stronger is certainly necessary, especially upon playing on a higher difficulty. Jadis mode, which is the hardest difficulty, sees the creatures of the witch pack quite the punch, and so normal skirmishes generally will see your whole team very close to being on the verge of death. For over a third of the game, Edmund is out of the picture, so I had an archer, warrior, and semi-mage combination with Susan, Peter, and Lucy. Depending on the situation, I swapped between the three constantly. If I had to fight some simpler enemies, I could use Peter. Kiting large enemies was a task for Susan, and Lucy had a wide range of abilities, like being able to fly around the map, or fight using panpipes or different touchscreen abilities. Due to the lower design needs of a handheld game, there were also a lot more allies and enemies than any other game, which helped with the longer runtime. Like in other titles, you have minotaurs and centaurs, but also here are dryads, satyrs, hags, wraiths. And despite the variety, however, wooses sadly didn't make the cut. Depending on how you like playing through a straightforward game, the side quests might be a bit contentious. As more of the world opens up, you'll be tasked with going back and forth to different locations on the map to defeat enemy groups or find MacGuffins. It can feel sometimes like the game is bringing you back and forth, but in some ways it feels intentional. If you're in a rush to get to the content, you can simply run past groups of enemies. If you decide to fight, however, not only do you get valuable ice shards, but experience to take on your next dungeon. There was one particular dungeon where my team was getting smacked down pretty hard, even after adopting a friendly bear as a replacement to Edmund. The solution for me was then to pursue some side quests, level up in the process, and use the rewards of said quests to go further bolster my team's ability to make my time easier. There's almost always a friendly Narnian creature in every part of the world willing to give you a side quest, and to the avid side quest doer, part of the charm is sort of orienteering and making routes to kill two birds with one stone. A potential comparison is, strangely enough, Xenoblade Chronicles, with its own plethora of optional objectives to make your team stronger, as well as have an excuse to interact with an interesting world and characters. The game sadly has flaws, and almost all of them appear in the latter half of the game. Overall, the main story does have a lot of lackluster moments similar to that of the Game Boy Advance game. The encounters with Malgrim are not at all tense because he's a pushover. The quests where the Narnians ask you to spar with them are incredibly easy, even on the hardest difficulty. Aslan still dies and comes back almost instantly, but at least in the Game Boy adaptation, he does things when he comes back. For the entirety of the game, the Great Lion just acts as a quest giver. Even when he cracks the stone table and returns from the dead, he just instructs Lucy and Susan to walk to the witch's castle instead of letting the children ride on his back as he does in every other adaptation. On screen, he does nothing to assist in bringing the good creatures back to life other than Tumnus, and so the witch's castle just feels like another trip to the dungeon like I had done twice before in previous side quests. It's not a victory over the witch, it's just another errand. I imagine Aslan not doing anything was due to a lack of time and constraints, but the least the game could have done was teleport me to the witch's castle. Oh well, at least Rumblebuffin's here, I guess.
And she turned you to stone.
Hey, what's that?
Turn you to stone, she did, and I've just restored you.
Well, drop me.
The Peter and Edmund conclusion is no better, with the Battle of Baruna being a gauntlet against a series of enemies before facing the White Witch. During the entirety of the game since I had met Aslan, he insisted that freeing the Narnians from the dungeons would help with the battle ahead. I wasn't expecting much, even just some Narnians standing on the battlefield, but when nobody showed up, even at the beginning of the fight, I was a bit miffed. Dying sets you back to the beginning of the mission, and so there is a rising tension of making your way to the witch. The problem, however, was fighting Jadis herself. On a harder difficulty, she has the ability to knock out Edmund with 3 hits, bringing you back to the start. Being cautious, I did my best to try to dodge her attacks. On my last attempt, however, I learned that she could be taken out with a small handful of attacks. The best strategy was to walk up to her and press A. The game also abruptly ends with the children being crowned kings and queens of Narnia, not bothering to return home, and their coronation is scored to the same music from the beginning where the Germans were bombing London. It's a really bad ending, and it's an absolute shame that the ball was dropped so hard at the end when the rest was so enjoyable. it leaves us a sour taste to the Narnia game that I personally enjoyed the most, and I can only imagine a deadline had to be hit, as it feels like this was a crawl to the finish. However, I was comforted by two things. As the credits rolled, I took note of who did the writing, as I enjoyed the adaptation, and that honor falls to Darby McDevitt. Looking into his career, you'll find a professional success story of someone whose early career was at a maze and making licensed content, to later writing the script for Assassin's Creed 4 and is now the narrative director for Ubisoft Montreal. It's interesting to think about how these small gigs help developers get into the industry, and how creative and talented men and women work in all facets of the industry, budget high or low. The final thing was that as the credits finished rolling and I was about to shut the game off, I was brought back to that wonderful title screen, a reminder of all the good that the game still had. So at the end of the day, did these games capture Narnia? Yes, but each in unique ways. While different versions have their own strengths and weaknesses, they are all very much feeling on brand with Lewis's work, but with consideration to the time. The tricky thing with adaptation is that they create an interesting web of what sources to be inspired by. Perhaps you might riff off other successful properties, keep it close to the source material, or maybe trudge out into the snow and go in your own direction. All answers are valid, and while some of these games turned out better than others, each was like a portal leading me to another version of the world to be explored. Join me next time as we look into more of those worlds. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you like what you see, make sure to subscribe to know when new uploads are released.